But we're, today to talk about, I think, a very important question, and that is, what are the dynamics and the DNA and ingredients of prosperity? And how does that tie into civil society, the social equation, the civil, contract? And we have three great panelists who are going to share with you from that stage. We've got Michelle Giuda, who is the CEO of the Koch Institute at Purdue University. She's the CEO of Tech Diplomacy. And we've got Dan Negre, who is the Senior Director of the Freedom and Prosperity Center at the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council, of course, is one of the sponsors of today's forum. And we have Kimberly Reed, who is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council Freedom and Prosperity Center, which he's also, importantly, the former chairman of the board and president and CEO of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, one of the major platforms that the United States has for supporting and financing significant projects that I think have unusual salience in today's conversation. So it's great to be with all of you. And we're going to make this work, and I feel like Big Brother on the screen, but hopefully this is all going to work. Dan, why don't I start with you? And I want to ask you, kind of lay out for our audience how you see the intersection between freedom and prosperity. These are big words. They're also fuzzy words. And sometimes to kind of get our head around something that, show us how they interact. When do you know you've got both? And do they really matter when it comes to economic development and success? Where does the freedom dimension come in? So let's start with Dan. He's just put together a very interesting and important report that hopefully is available to all of you. But let's start with Dan, and we'll move to our great panel.
Wonderful. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so first of all, I'm delighted to be here. So thank you, Mr. Giuda, for being the spark behind what we are creating. Thank you, Joanna, for inviting me. We are thrilled, speaking on behalf of the Freedom Prosperity Center, to be partners with Project Romania 2030. Let me start with a very general question, and then I will tell you a little bit about the results of our analysis as they regard Romania. I listened to the conversation this morning, and I heard a lot about the role of the government and of the state in planning and making things happen. I also heard one of the immediately preceding speakers quote John Maynard Keynes, wonderful economist. Let me offer another perspective that is very strong in the United States. So I'm speaking as an American. All here, we are Americans. You heard a lot of Europeans before, so you get a transatlantic balance with us, which is Milton Friedman and the President Ronald Reagan, who said the government is not the answer, the government is the problem. And he also said that the most frightening words that the businessman can hear are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. There is most definitely an important role for the government. The government has to assure, first of all, security, and in our indexes we have an indicator that measures security. If you have civil war or riots or so on, you have nothing. The government needs to assure, as Mr. Attali said, that you have law that is fairly applied, and that not just the citizens, but also those in power respect the laws. But I think it's extraordinarily important to leave room for the private sector, for the talent of the people to express themselves. The government should approach things with a lot of humility, because few people cannot make decisions for a whole country. And one of the reasons why China is in extraordinary trouble these days is because one man, Xi Jinping, he's picked up from Mao, and he thinks he can make decisions for 1,000,000,004 people. And when growth was at 10%, and when the Deng Xiaoping reforms were implemented, now it's at 5%, because now they have again a genius leader leading their country. So all I would like to propose is to try to find a balance because between the role of the government, which is very important, and the private sector, the initiative of the people, trusting the people to make decisions. So maybe in addition to...
But Dan, I'm going to intervene here. I'd love to hear the nature of your report, because, you know, I think when you talk about China, I mean, I largely agree with you, but at the same time, I'm just going to be honest, China brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. They had extraordinary success. We've had lots of books and analysis written about illiberal economic development, illiberal government and economic development. And I think that's part of the challenge today, is does that work? And so I'm interested in what your research that you've done at the center shows about what the flaws in that argument are, and what are the building blocks or the ties between prosperity. So I'm less interested in assertion than I am in research.
So thank you very much. I love your question so much that people will start suspecting that I've planted the questions with you, which obviously it's not the case. Very soon you'll be able to see on our website a report that actually is also available here, which is this report, which is available outside. And what you're seeing there is a very interesting analysis where we are showing the hockey stick growth in China. Yes, they took 800 million people from living under $1 a day out of extreme poverty to the next level up. But when you compare their performance with the performance of Taiwan and South Korea, where they have freedom, what you discover that these three countries that were comparably poor in the 1960s have very different results. They were, number one, in the 60s, they were all dictatorships. South Korea and Taiwan were military dictatorships. China was a communist dictatorship. So South Korea and Taiwan had at least economic freedom, and they had legal freedom. The legal system was independent. And then what you'll notice that, especially after South Korea and Taiwan also added the democracy element to their success formula, they escaped the middle income trap, while China, even today, is caught in the middle income trap. So when you compare the three countries, you will see that China is actually underperforming.
Interesting. Well, let me jump to Michelle, and I would love to, as you know, because part of the other dimension here, we've seen this in Romania, is rushing forward, and how technology has become such a platform for scaling economic opportunity, changing the digital space. But as you kind of look at that, I know, Michelle, from your work, there are also dangers that lurk in the system. And there is a problem, you kind of look at how you empower people, bring them together, create economic activity. And of course, Kimberly is very, very involved in this as well. But what are the dangers that lurk in human connectivity and bringing technology in that we should be aware of and think about more seriously?
Thanks, Steve. I'll come back to Mr. Giuda's remarks this morning, in which he noted that there was this notion at the end of the Cold War, perhaps, that there would be this end of history, and that we're realizing, in fact, that that is not the case. And there is this four-dimensional contest between the free world and authoritarian states, and it's four-dimensional. It's military, it's economic, it's cultural, it's diplomatic. And when it comes to technology, technology is at the crossroads of that competition. And we believe at the Kroc Institute that technology must advance freedom. And we'll either see AI, 5G, quantum, space, all of these emerging and critical technologies advance freedom and all of the values that we care about in the free world, or be weaponized by authoritarian states and used to suppress some of that freedom. And so we believe that technology must advance freedom, and it comes down to the very concept of this conference here, which is trust. And we know that trusted tech is needed in order to advance freedom. And by trust, we mean the principles that we all share. respect for human rights, respect for the rule of law, respect for intellectual property, integrity, reciprocity, transparency, all of these things that bind us together in the free world have to be at the center of how we use new, critical, and emerging technologies. And it's a competitive advantage. And if you go back to some of the data that Dan was just highlighting in his research, trust is the ultimate accelerator for innovation, for freedom, and for prosperity. And so it's a competitive advantage for countries like Romania, who are on the cusp of a great leap economically, technologically, and culturally. And so it comes down to not just freedom and prosperity, but trust is the ultimate accelerator for that.
But how do you get the gravity to go in the right direction there? And you know, yesterday here in Washington, we had at Singapore a significant conference on you know, basically AI and cybersecurity. Let's just take this for a minute. That AI, the notion is that artificial intelligence is an incredible tool. It can solve incredible problems for mankind and society. But cyber thieves and cyber criminals are getting many of the same tools that the cyber protectors have. And you just laid this out. And I guess the question I have, and one of the things that came up, is if China, in its network of relationships and financing and global development, has essentially a marketplace for its values and its technology, and I gotta say that the future of the global middle class is not in the transatlantic relationship. It's in Southeast Asia, it's in Africa, it's in other parts of the world. How do you get market power, economic power, and dynamism behind the values you're talking about?
You just used the magic word, Steve, which is network. And I'll give you a case study for how this can be done and can continue to be done. So in 2020, when I was at the State Department working with our founder, Keith Kroc, who's the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, we built this thing called the Clean Network. And it was a clean network to secure 5G and essentially make sure that Huawei did not become the dominant 5G provider of choice for all of our partners and allies across the world. And Deputy Secretary Giuda was a critical partner in doing that. And NATO came early on where we were able to create a network of networks to abide by a set of trust principles, the ones I just outlined before: reciprocity, transparency, security, to make sure that those were the principles that defined our 5G networks, so that Huawei didn't become the center of that. And it worked, and we brought public and private together. There were 60 countries, 200 telecommunications companies, 2/3 of global GDP were a part of the Clean Network. That is strength in numbers, and that type of network can be used to compete with other authoritarian states, not just in 5G, but all of these other critical and emerging tech sectors we just talked about, whether it's quantum, artificial intelligence, Steve, or some of these others are going to be very critical to our national and our international security. So working together across countries, across sectors, and public and private, organized all of it around trust principles, is the proven model for how this gets done.
Thank you, Kimberly. You know, I want to, have you. I mean, you're an advisor to both institutes on the panel, but I also want to just know that you led one of my favorite institutions, which is the Exim Bank of the United States, which is involved with really key critical gap financing. And I want to be honest, you kind of come where Dan is and, hear about the connections between freedom and prosperity, about economic development. And from, again, a U.S. perspective, what I worry about is America in the game, versus China. If you go to Africa, you go to Southeast Asia, you go to Eastern Europe, where we're at. And what I hear from a lot of people is, hey, we would rather deal with American entities or transatlantic, transnational firms, but they're not here, and China's giving a good deal. So help us understand in real form, how Exim changes that, and do you think that when it comes to international commerce, engagement, investment, and then this question of tech and prosperity, America is performing at the level it should be, or are we basically lagging?
Thank you very much, and it's so nice to be with all of you. I first came to this country on New Year's Eve 2010, where I celebrated 2011 at your Opera House, so I don't know if any of you were there. And I next visited Romania in 2020 when I was chairman of something called the Export-Import Bank of the United States. And as the Deputy Secretary knows so well, Deputy Secretary General knows so well, and as we've heard on each of the panels today, you have to do long-term planning with partners and allies. And we're so proud of where Romania is today. And that's been a long process for you. And this conference is raising the issues of where you need to go for the future. So I just want to share with you a little bit, and thank you, Steve, on my experience at XM. Committed to helping countries like Romania around the world. And I had an honor in October of 2020 to welcome to the U.S. Export-Import Bank in Washington your Minister for Economy, Energy, and Business Climate, Popescu. And we signed a $7 billion memorandum of understanding because the United States, under my leadership, very much wanted to work together to promote business development, particularly in energy and infrastructure here. And then just 2 months later, I was invited to come to Bucharest, and I actually was the very first official external meeting with your interim Prime Minister, Chauca. And so we then focused again in detail on how we can help and expand and modernize your nuclear energy efforts. And I was welcomed to Chernivtsi, where I met with the CEO, Cosmin Giuda, and saw where 20% of your power comes from. But I also heard the story of how you really need to modernize what you're doing. And Dan mentioned Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had the foresight with Romania as well. And back then, in 1981, when he was just 4 months into office, the U.S. Export-Import Bank had a law saying that could not invest in certain communist and socialist countries. And Ronald Reagan had the foresight to say, I'm going to ask for an exception, and actually made an investment through XM of $121 million to allow Chernivtsi to be able to purchase generators from the United States. So it started then. I'm also involved with an effort through the Richard Nixon Presidential Library called the Nixon Seminar. We gather monthly online to talk about key foreign policy issues. And I know Richard Nixon was very important to Romania in the start of where you are today. So it's a wonderful, wonderful path to be on. So I was here to see that. And then I had the honor of meeting Deputy Secretary General Giuda at a Kroc event, Keith Kroc Institute event in May of this year. So thank you very much, sir, for asking me to be here today. Even though I'm no longer in office, because I worked in the prior administration, my successor has continued the efforts that we started. And so I'm so pleased to see that back in September of this year, a $57 million direct loan was approved by the US Exim Bank for a company called Inegro Nuclear to allow for a pre-construction engineering and feasibility study for Chernivtsi. And we've seen that letters of interest totaling $3 billion for companies like Fluor and NewScale to come and do hopeful investments here are on the horizon. So what does it take? We care about having good, trusted relationships. And what does it take? And Iona Mates, I also want to recognize her. She challenged me to address today, what does it take to do friendshoring in Romania? And I don't know if you've heard of that term, but we want the United States here, not China, not Russia. We want the United States here. And so friendshoring with partner and ally countries. What does it take? I'm involved with another organization called the Council on Competitiveness, and they have some pro-growth competitiveness policy pillars. And we've talked about a lot of those today, but I just want to underscore that. What does it take for the future? Talent. You have a huge talent, and we really want to see your diaspora community come back as well. Too much of your population is living outside your borders, and so you need to create the environment for having them return. Also technology. We're hearing a lot about that, and the future's great. Investment in infrastructure, physical and cyber. But you need to have a regulatory framework that's based on the rule of law. You need to have transparency. You need to have a strong fiscal and monetary policy, a good corporate tax structure, IP protection, and antitrust efforts. Sounds like Romania is on the right track, but some challenges I have for you. You must have an even regulatory system to entice more dynamic foreign investment. So those of you who are elected officials, please focus in on that, an even regulatory system. You also need a process for business regulation that's streamlined. You're doing that now. You're doing good work in that. But you need to also focus in a little bit more on your bankruptcy protection. So take a look at that. Labor regulation flexibility. That's another challenge for Romania right now. So encourage you to take a look at that. And then always, we can't have corruption. And you're doing a good job, but we always need to be mindful and hold bad actors accountable so that that trust continues. So I hope, Steve, that answers some of your
well, let me go a notch further, and since I think my friend Mircea Giona is in the audience, hello Mircea, I was at David Bradley's home last night, here in Washington, and I think that you're very, very lucky in Romania to have such an important architect of global security, kind of committed in these global security things. And I think if I were interviewing Mircea right now, he would say that America is engaged, America is showing up, and America is vital to the security tapestry in Europe. And I guess my question is, in the private side, I mean, basically Dan was getting at this issue, and Michelle as well, of the distinction between government and private sector. And I guess where I have a little bit of doubt or concern is on the robustness of attention of American firms in the world. And I just want to be honest that I wish it were there, but we're not going to have a rah-rah conference. We're going to have a real discussion. What do you think needs to be done to leverage more engagement from major U.S. firms in the region so that they're not necessarily easily seduced or attracted to the China option or other options? And that's why I saw EXIM so important. And EXIM has done incredibly important things. But is it enough? I mean, are we doing what we should be doing on the U.S. side of the equation, separate from what Romania is? Because I see China basically in every market. I'm not sure I see some of our U.S. Major firms in every market.
So the question is for whom?
Well, I'm asking Kimberly, but you can all jump in.
Yeah. Well, I'll just begin. I think we're making those efforts. The principles I just laid out will help for more. I also think more partnership and engagement in Washington. I know the embassy is quite engaged in Washington, but it's having these relationships through competitiveness councils or through think tanks, but also through chambers, the Romanian Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. When I was at EXIM, I pounded really hard, and this was even during COVID, to help U.S. small businesses understand across all 50 states the beauty of the global marketplace. For America, 95% of the customers live outside the U.S., but it's helping American companies understand what we need to do to bridge the gap. Government can help with that, but I think also Romania sharing its story in the United States is key in building that trust one-on-one. Right. And I'll defer to my colleagues.
Yeah,
can
Michelle,
I jump in? Michelle, when you ask my question, the other thing I want to basically ask you to talk about, Brad Smith, the CEO of the president of Microsoft, talks about tools and weapons in technology. The technology can be used, put to use to help us solve social problems, national security problems. It can also be used to imprison us. That facial recognition software has become a key part, for instance, of China's social capital system and creating, incredible penalties for its population and citizens. And so I just love you as you kind of look at this question on American engagement and American norms. And then not that I want this to be narcissistic about the United States, we're talking about Romania, but I also want to know, are we bringing, you know, compelling norms and patterns of behavior around technology that is working?
So I want to give it also relates to what Kim was just saying and then answers your question, Steve, interesting example from a trip I just took to Vietnam. I was in Vietnam a couple weeks ago. An interesting case study there. They're still a communist state. My mother fled Vietnam in 1975. My father served there in the Vietnam War. So very interesting for me to go back, been back several times. But they are at an interesting point in their history too. The United States and Vietnam just signed a U.S. Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, which is the highest level of diplomacy for Vietnam. And they're at the brink also, and you can feel it, of taking that next great leap. They're a lower middle income country. They want to be higher middle income by 2030, high income by 2045. And what's it going to take for them to seize that next great leap? That was a big question in all of the meetings I had with government officials, private sector leaders there. And again, it came down to trust. One of the centerpieces of this new U.S.-Vietnam relationship is technology. And how are we going to collaborate further on critical and emerging technologies, and specifically right now, semiconductors. And they want workforce, talent capacity building, they want more collaboration in R&D, they want investment from American companies, and they want tech transfer. That only happens if there's trust. And that only happens if American companies believe that the technology that we would provide to Vietnam is being used to advance freedom and the values that we care about, and not some of these other values, Steve, that you had highlighted, like surveillance, controlling the citizenry, and others. So it comes down to these values that are at the center of Dan's research, which show that those values enable frictionless collaboration, because we know that the things that we're collaborating on are going to advance shared values. And so again, comes down to trust, and you know, that will be the game changer for Vietnam if it wants to seize that opportunity, if it wants to attract investment from American tech companies in particular. And again, that's where Romania has a competitive advantage, already abiding by so many of those principles that are going to enable that collaboration, not only with the United States, but other foreign partners and allies, to build that investment and collaboration.
So let me
and I think I'm going to give Dan Negre the last word. And Dan, as you respond, one of the things I'd love to hear from you, and I know we're trying to reclaim some time for the conference, but I'm really interested in how you not only see the Romania situation, but Eastern Europe. You know, right now you've got a very interesting political direction in Poland that was surprising, and people are very heartened, some by that prosperity and freedom dimension, but others are worried about some of the directions that Slovakia may be going. There continues to be ongoing concern about the solvency of democracy in a country like Hungary. So I just want to be honest that the tapestry that we see in Europe is uneven and different. How do you think that affects economic aspirations and economic development, to get to the nitty-gritty of the report and research you're doing? And we're going to give you the last word and then close out this panel.
Yeah, this is too hard a question, so I'll take the question that you asked Kim, and that's too complex. So let me come back, if I may, please, to the question that you asked before, which is a fascinating question, which is, are we Americans, you asked, are we present? Are we doing enough? Well, thank God, it's not the American government. Again, my point earlier, government versus the private sector. Coming to Romania, coming to another country, is the private sector. So I had the privilege to serve at the Department of State with Michelle, who was a star, and in another agency was Kim. So one day I found myself across the table with the delegation from, say, one of the stans, one of the countries in Central Asia. It was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The Undersecretary should have gone. He was busy. Assistant Secretary was busy, so they sent it to me. I was a deputy assistant. So this gentleman said, we want more American investment. So my answer to him was, capital is a finicky, difficult guest. If you treat him well, he comes to dinner with you, but if you don't treat him well, he leaves.
Right.
So it's not so much, is America coming? The question is, what is Romania doing to make Romania a very desirable place for American companies to come. So we are producing a freedom index, we are producing a prosperity index. And I can tell you that so we did recently an analysis specifically for this event because I wanted to look good. Mr. Giuda was here. Clara Voluntiru, his professor, she'll give me a grade, so I wanted to look good. So I did some analysis. So what I can tell you is that we compared Romania from 1995 to 2022. We compared it against the European Union, and we compared it against against Poland and Czechia. And I can tell you that Romania closed the gap with the European Union and closed the gap with Czechia and Poland in freedom and in prosperity. But then we see there were two things that surprised me, and they are a matter of some concern, but also the opportunity. So one of them was in political freedom. Romania didn't improve its ranking during this period of time. That was number one. And actually, 20 to 22, it lost a few ranks. But the thing that really shocked me, since 2003, Romania's score for education has not improved. So the European score improved, the Poland score improved, Czechia improved, even the global, the average for all countries improved, but Romania is flat. So Romania has a great geographic strategic position that we saw before, very talented people, it's a fun place. I also ate again Romanian food, it's fabulous. Bucharest looks great. Education, and again, to quote Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General Joanna and Giacomo, the importance of having rules and regulation, the rule of law strong, then there will be private capital coming in.
Yeah, well, I just want to say thank you to Dan, because I think this data, comparative data over time, is extremely important. Tomorrow in Washington, Kimberly, I'll be speaking at the annual Export-Import Bank conference and interviewing Oksana Markarova, who is the former Minister of Finance in Ukraine, now the Ukraine ambassador to the United States, about exactly these issues. I'll also be interviewing Amos Hochstein, who is the energy advisor on the National Security Council to President Biden. So again, coming and looking at this question of how do we get the equation right when it comes to U.S. engagement, how does it come in and deal with national security questions? And I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you, but I think this question of freedom and prosperity is going to be vital for your near neighbor in Ukraine as it looks at its future and development as well. So I want to thank Dan DeGraves, the Senior Director of the Freedom and Prosperity Center of the Atlantic Council, Kimberly Reed, the former President and CEO of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, and of course Michelle Giuda, who is the Executive Director of the Kratch Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue University. Thank you all very much. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you. Hello, Mircea, Giona, and everyone. I look forward to being there with you.
Urmează o pauză de cafea de 10 minute și apoi ne întoarcem pentru ultimul panel înainte de prânz. Înainte de prânz, la ora 14:30 va fi prânzul, 10 minute și apoi v-aș ruga să vă întoarceți în sală. Mulțumim!